The Committee on Natural Resources will come to order. The committee today is meeting to hear testimony on the Department of Interior's spending priorities and the President's fiscal year 2020 budget proposal. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking member. I ask unanimous consent, therefore, that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. We look forward to having Mr. Bernhardt before this committee in the very near future to continue the discussion we begin today. I would and let me begin my opening statement. If taken seriously, the FY 2020 budget proposal for the Department of Interior would devastate the department, its workforce, and the special places it was created to protect. It proposes a 14% cut to Interior at a time when the department is in desperate need of more funding. DOI lacks funding and staff to keep up with the significant backlogs, including long overdue repairs to beloved national parks, long lists of species at risk for extinction, awaiting basic protections. These species await basic protections, overdue projects to address water supply shortages, and desperately needed repairs for schools serving Indigenous families. This budget request seeks radical reductions to land acquisition programs, effectively ending the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a program that was just permanently authorized with overwhelming bipartisan support. It proposes to slash the Fish and Wildlife Service budget by 16%, which would dramatically compromise their ability to help endangered species recover. The Bureau of Land Management would take a 10% hit overall, but somehow will still be given significant increases to coal management and to speed up oil and gas permitting. Probably the most destructive part of the budget is the administration's ongoing climate denial. With 25% of the country's emissions coming from public lands, we need real leadership from Interior. Instead, we are faced with proposals like a 77% cut to core climate science programs at the U.S. Geological Survey, zeroing out funding to help Indigenous peoples prepare for the worst that climate change will bring. These devastating cuts would come at a time of uncertainty, chaos, and vulnerability at the department. Before resigning only a few months ago, former Secretary Zinke wreaked considerable havoc on Interior. He racked up 20 federal investigations, at least 4 are still pending. 2 have reportedly been sent to the Justice Department. He conducted the widely opposed and illegal recession of national monuments. He started the expansion of offshore drilling despite bipartisan opposition. He launched an unprofessional department reorganization and accelerated an already declining morale, even more so across the department. Acting Secretary Bernhardt has a chance to right that ship, but early signs are troubling. The only possible remedy for the harm done to the department over the last 2 years is a renewed commitment to absolute transparency, full cooperation with Congress, and investments in rooting out conflicts of interest and profiteering. Neither of the priorities set forth in this budget request or Acting Secretary Bernhardt's behavior so far gives any indication things are going to change, and in fact seems to indicate that the department may continue to partner with big business as usual. My colleagues across the aisle have suggested the solution to the crisis at Interior Department is to create a new accounting schemes to give the appearance that Congress is addressing these shortfalls. Of course, these schemes come with massive mandatory price tags, which my colleagues have no plan to pay for. This is not the answer. The answer is Congress to make those who profit from the public lands and resources pay their fair share for that privilege. The answer is to increase appropriated funding for the department and its agencies. The answer is to invest in an infrastructure package that fixes the decaying roads, bridges on federal lands. We need to find courage to invest in the future of our public lands and resources, not simply to hide or paper over the mess. I appreciate both of our witnesses for taking the time to be here today and hope you will help us understand how this budget would serve the American people. And as I stated earlier, we look forward to having Mr. Bernhardt upon completion one would assume a successful confirmation process to be before this committee in the very near future to continue this discussion. With that, I turn to our ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for his opening statement.
Thank you, and I welcome both the witnesses who are here today. Today we're going through a process that simply checks the box that will then be ignored by the appropriators. We do this every year. It's your turn to have this opportunity to be here. But with that, it does fulfill our responsibility to do some kind of oversight, and this annual hearing is supposed to do that and talk about what are problem areas and tough decisions. I have to compliment the Department of Interior this time. Unlike prior administrations, I think you've been honest about the challenges that you're facing, and you've also, in your testimony, given us some solutions on which we can work. And what I hope we can be able to do is find areas where there is bipartisan ability to find some of those solutions. Specifically, I would look towards the park maintenance backlog to show the extent of the issue. It is 4 times larger than the amount of money we give to the Park Service. We cannot simply do business as usual. If we expect to do another simple appropriations, it's simply not going to happen, especially in divided government. So I'm glad that the Park Service Department of Interior has come up with some alternative concepts that we haven't done in a long time. In fact, the last time we made a major effort to deal with the park backlog, Frank Robinson and Roberta Clemente were MVPs in the major leagues, and Reagan was a leader in the state of California. It's been a long time since we made a concerted effort. I appreciate the many members of Congress last year, including Chairman Grijalva, who worked in the 115th Congress to find a solution that is actually workable and creative. The roadblocks that we found at the very end of last year are no longer there. We have a new opportunity of finding something that is truly bipartisan, and I appreciate you emphasizing that in your written testimony as well. Democrats, particularly those from the West, have also noticed how our federal forests have been torched of late, burned to the ground, and we can work together to improve forest health. It is not simply a matter of appropriations. We actually took care of that. It is also a process of management. The budget request that you have done talks about policy issues, and I understand that we are to receive more in the coming days from both the Forest Service as well as the Department of Interior. And I look forward to reviewing those proposals once we see it. I think that is another area in which we can easily and clearly work in a bipartisan manner. Before I go on, there are a couple of other areas I'd like to talk about. I want to yield, because I don't know if we'll ever get to him, 1 minute to Mr. Curtis of my opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I'm pleased because it was a year ago at this hearing that I asked Secretary Zinke about a reservation system at Arches National Park. It's caused a great deal of consternation among the locals, and was so pleased last week to learn that underneath the Acting Secretary Bernhard and Kate Cannon, the superintendent, they've actually pulled back from their plans to do a reservation system and are implementing a rigorous study of all the options. What's so pleasing about this is that they've listened so carefully to the local residents, the local elected leaders, and been responsive to their needs. I think it's just a tremendous example of how we can all work together. And I yield back to the ranking member.
And reclaiming my last minute and 40 seconds, I want to thank you for that. I think it shows an effort on the part of this Interior Department to try and deal with what is best for people, especially in the last shutdown, where the Interior Department, especially in the Park Service, came up with a concept that was legal, and also was an effort to try and make sure that people were not hurt, in vast contrast to a prior administration who did everything they could to make life much more miserable, including a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act on the Mall of the Capitol. I also want to recognize and ask the chairman to look at the fact that you also talked about Florea. Florea has been something that is important to me for the last 10 years, and I have not been able to find a solution to it. But I would hope, once again, in a bipartisan way, we can find a way of dealing with Florea in a way that actually provides congressional oversight on the system of how we get fees and how they are used to make sure that we actually do maintain our maintenance backlog and maintain that the money that is raised by fees is used in the area in which it is raised and not will be absconded to other kinds of situations. Now, with that, there's a lot of good things that you have proposed, and once again, I want to applaud you for taking the courage to actually proposing some new and creative solutions and not simply trying to hide behind some of the rhetoric. So in your written statement, it's positive. I hope this is going to be an enjoyable experience for you. It won't be, but I certainly hope that it will be. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop. And let me introduce our witnesses. Mr. Scott Cameron is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, Management, and Budget at the Department of Interior. Mr. Cameron is joined by Denise Flanagan, who is the Director of the Office of Budget, also at Interior. And I want to thank both of you very much for taking time to be here today. As the system, as you're well aware, the system works. Once it turns yellow in front of you, you have 1 minute to wrap up. And then after Mr. Cameron has testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. With that, let me recognize Assistant Secretary Cameron for his opening statement. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, members of the committee. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of President Trump's FY 2020 budget for the Department of the Interior. And if I might, notwithstanding Mr. Bishop's observations about the role of the Appropriations Committee, I've got to say, as someone who once was a staffer to a former member of this committee, I have a great deal of respect and value the role of this committee in congressional deliberations. So I'm especially pleased to be here with you today. I do have a few opening remarks, and with your permission, I would like to submit my entire written statement for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection. Thank you.
Interior's budget request for 2020 is $12.6 billion. In fiscal year 2020, Interior will have access to $300 million in additional funding in the event of a severe wildland fire season through Disaster Cap Authority. We're pleased to be able to share with you that the President's 2020 budget for Interior is nearly $1 billion above the President's 2019 request for the Department. This additional investment on the part of the White House, we believe, signals both the significance of our programs and the results we deliver for the American people. At the same time, our budget is fiscally responsible. Looking at our 2020 request, you'll see we've prioritized investment in our core land and resource management operations, the services and results that Americans rely on us to deliver on the ground every day in our national parks, our wildlife refuges, and on our public lands. We do emphasize taking care of the land the Congress has already asked us to manage rather than acquiring new lands. Programmatically, our objective is to strike the right balance between resource protection and sustainable use of America's resources. At a high level, this budget invests in 5 broad goals: promote collaborative conservation, support safe and secure communities, strengthen America's energy and mineral security, honor our trust responsibilities, and reorganize the Department of the Interior to more effectively and efficiently serve the American people. Associated with our funding request are 2 important legislative proposals, one on active forest management and reproposal of the Public Lands Infrastructure Fund. These pieces of legislation, which we hope will be delivered to the Congress shortly, will significantly advance our ability to proactively reduce wildfire risks and costs and care for Interior's iconic infrastructure. I'd like to take just a moment to mention 3 topics. First, the budget for wildland fire totals $920 million, including almost $200 million for fuels management, which is $5 million above the 2019 enacted level. This investment will help improve the health of Interior's forest and rangelands while reducing wildland fire risk and risk to public health and safety. Second, strengthening Interior's infrastructure remains a priority. Our budget includes $1.5 billion for maintenance and construction across Interior. Third, the administration's emphasis on education is reflected in the fact that for the first time, the Bureau of Indian Education is presented in the budget as a distinct entity. It is no longer simply part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Under President Trump's leadership, the Department of the Interior has accomplished much on behalf of the American people in the past 2 years. Our 2020 budget enables us to continue to deliver these results and remain fiscally responsible. I'm happy to take your questions, and as always, we look forward to working with the committee as it does its important work in the months ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Cameron, let me begin. Most of the document requests that this committee has sent have gone unanswered, even those that were modest in scope. Does anybody in Congress get responses from Interior at the same pace? And is this committee being treated any differently than anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, we've been very active, I think, maybe perhaps even prolific in our production of documents. We have produced something in the order of 10,000 documents for the Congress, representing around 50,000 pages of material. We are, I assure you, on a daily basis, compiling, sorting additional documents to try to be responsive to the Congress.
Well, let me direct you to, if I may, Mr. Cameron, to the screens above. Less than 2 weeks ago, March 14th, an email went out from Executive Secretariat to employees at Interior, the Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife across the country. It said, quote, "Until I get formal written direction, I am asking that any correspondence being sent to any senator, as well as Representative Grijalva, not be sent until you have further direction. This includes letters sent by senators to regions, states, etc." End quote. What happened around March 14th that warranted a sudden change in how you describe DOA communications with this committee and with the Senate?
Mr. Chairman, I've got no specific knowledge of that letter, of that memo, who was sent to, why, what the rationale was. I can tell you, as a matter of course, our Office of Congressional Liaison tries to keep on track of all correspondence with the Congress to ensure that we can, in fact, be responsive.
Well, do you know why the email was sent?
I have no idea, sir.
You know who sent it?
I can't make that out. It looks like it's been blacked out.
And you haven't seen the email before today?
No. That looks like all new information to me.
Okay. Then March 15th, on March 15th, Mr. Bernhardt's nomination hearing date was announced. You worked on Capitol Hill, as you indicated, and in several administrations. Do you see any connection between the March 14th email and the March 15th announcement?
Sir, I don't think it would serve any purpose for me to speculate on a rationale over a memo I've got no knowledge of.
Okay, well, there was a follow-up email went out a week later saying, quote, "Anything going to the Senate or Representative Grijalva, regardless of signature level, must be reviewed and surnamed by John Tanner and Greg Rinkies at DOI," end quote. Do you know what Mr. Tanner and Mr. Rinkies are working on?
They are helping. Acting Secretary Bernhardt, I believe, with this confirmation process. Although John Tanner is also has a role in our congressional relations function more generally. And
but we still don't know the reason for this email. And you still don't know the reason for the email, correct?
That's correct, sir. I haven't seen this before.
Mr. Renke's supervisor, Rob Gordon, reports to you, doesn't he?
Yes, but Greg was recently detailed to the immediate office of the Secretary.
Mr. Renke's works theoretically under you. He's currently working on nominations, and just before Mr. Bernhardt's announcement was made, he becomes in charge of filtering all communications from Interior, from Fish and Wildlife, and from Park Service. But you don't know about the timing or why it's being done, correct?
Sir, I can assure you that our Office of Congressional Liaison still maintains the primary responsibility for managing all correspondence with the Congress.
Yeah, that's my understanding. My understanding is highly unusual for the Office of Policy Analysis to play a role of congressional correspondence reviewer. Can you think of a reason that all the senators and myself and also the committee would have all requests reviewed by the office, every single one?
Mr. Chairman, I can only tell you that Greg Rankus is now on detail to the Office of the Secretary. He is not running the Office of Policy Analysis.
Well, why is this email, quite frankly, not evidence of an attempt to withhold or slow walk information from Congress until the confirmation hearing is done?
I'm not prepared to speculate that. I think that's a supposition, and I'm not sure I'd agree with your premise, sir.
Okay, let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Bishop. Mr. McClintock, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cameron, first and foremost, I want to thank the Department of the Interior for the way it managed the recent shutdown. We had a shutdown during the Obama administration. That administration deliberately went out of its way to harm people. They forced vendors that were simply operating on federal land to close their doors, canceled reservations at Yosemite and our other parks, barricaded gates, even went so far as to barricade turnouts on the highway overlooking Yosemite so people couldn't pull over and even get a glimpse of the valley during the shutdown. This administration responded in exactly the opposite fashion. They did everything they could to keep the parks operating. Vendors were not required to shut down. Reservations were honored. The gates were open. And extraordinary measures were taken to assure that garbage was being picked up. And I cannot thank you enough on behalf of all of the gateway communities of Yosemite, Sequoia, and Kings Canyon that depend upon tourism. DOI did an extraordinary job, and it was in stark contrast to the deliberate harm that the Obama administration did under the same shutdown scenario. Let me talk a little bit about water and then get back to land for a moment. As you know, the California State Water Resources Control Board has passed phase 1 of its water quality control plan with dire implications for water availability in the state. Is reclamation going to sue, as was stated in Commissioner Berman's letter of July 25th, 2018 to the State Board?
Sir, I've got no specific knowledge about what the Bureau of Reclamation might plan on doing on that matter, and as a matter involving litigation, the Justice Department, of course, would have the final call on that.
Has Reclamation expressed its concerns to the U.S. EPA regarding phase 1 of the water quality control plan since the letter was issued in July of 2018?
I have no specific knowledge of that, sir. I'm sorry. I was prepared to testify on the budget today as opposed to matters that might be regulatory or litigation in nature.
Well, I'd appreciate getting an answer back to these questions as quickly as possible. As you can imagine, they're very important to the people of California.
Absolutely, sir. I understand that, and I think many people would agree that California needs more water storage, and we'll be happy to be responsive for the record.
Great, thank you. And we also have to take care of the precious little water that we currently can store behind our reservoirs. You'd mentioned that you were prioritizing maintenance ahead of acquisition. Why is that?
Sir, as this committee knows, we have an embarrassment of riches in terms of national wildlife refuges, national parks, and BLM lands. And we are really putting emphasis on trying to manage those lands as effectively as we can, which means that we are putting relatively more resources into on-the-ground management of our lands where we interact with the public or visitors on a day-to-day basis. And as a result of that decision to invest in public-facing personnel, we've unfortunately had to budget not quite as much for maintenance as we'd like. However, we do have $1.5 billion in the President's budget for maintenance.
But we are giving priority to maintenance over acquisition.
That's exactly correct. We need to manage the lands that we currently have better as opposed to acquiring new lands as a general principle.
Interestingly, when John Jervis, Obama's parks director, was before this committee many years ago, I asked him the same question, and he gave the same answer, that given the choice, they would prioritize maintenance over acquisition. My colleague Louis Gohmert once compared the federal government to the old miser who's got the biggest house in town. It's dilapidated, the paint's peeling, the windows are broken, weeds are growing because he spends all of his time and resources plotting how he's going to acquire his neighbor's property. The maintenance backlog at the national parks is becoming of critical concern, and why we are acquiring new land when we're not taking care of the land we currently own is beyond me, and I applaud the administration's priorities there. One final question on active forest management. We used to make money auctioning off surplus federal timber. We had healthy forests and a healthy economy. Is that essentially your direction to the future, is to get back to those days when we could take care of our land and at profit?
That is correct, sir. We're interested in improving forest management for ecological reasons, for economic reasons, for employment reasons, all across the board.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Sablar?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cameron, welcome. Let me start. I take note of the Department of Interior's action giving greater attention to Bureau of Indian Education. The department's management of Indian country schools is not something the department should be proud of. So I appreciate that. Mr. Cameron, let me have and I need short answers from you if possible. What do you pay for electricity at home?
I pay about $150 a month, depending upon whether it's the summer or winter. Right. My AC is running.
According to the December 2018 U.S. Energy Information Administration, you pay 11 cents per kilowatt hour. Do you know what my constituents in the Marianas pay?
No, sir, I do not.
All right. We pay 35 cents per kilowatt hour, more than 3 times what you pay. That is why I got the Low-Income Household Energy Assistance Program, LIHIAP, increased in February of 2014. But don't you think it would be better instead of LIHIAP if Congress helped those families pay for power themselves, Mr. Cameron?
Sir, I do know that our Office of Insular International Affairs has been working with a number of the jurisdictions in the Pacific to try to promote renewable energy such as solar and wind.
We'll get there, sir. But wouldn't it be better policy if we didn't just focus on the few hundred households that qualify for LIHIAP, but did something to benefit everyone, all the residents and businesses of the Marianas and throughout the other 3 insular areas? You would think that, right?
So the LIHIAP program is a program of the Department of Energy, and I must confess I know next to nothing about it, so I don't really feel qualified to comment on that. I apologize.
So, okay, but you know, to help as many people as we can, in 2014 we raised LIHIAP in February. We enacted legislation in December, Public Law 113-235, to create energy action teams. Their job was to develop energy action plans for each insular area with financing and engineering all laid out with a timeline and help implement those plans. The plans were supposed to reduce reliance on imported fuels, develop domestic energy sources, and improve the overall efficiency of our energy systems. With benchmarks, Mr. Cameron, here's the goal for 2015, 2016, 2017, and so on. Does that sound like a reasonable course of action to you, Mr. Cameron?
It sounds like a very interesting and a set of good ideas, but other than that sort of visceral, uninformed reaction, I'm not in a position to comment. I'm part of the administration.
And it's not an idea, sir. The law required the teams to report to the Secretary of Interior every year on their progress. And the Secretary was supposed to submit those reports to Congress every year. Did you know that?
No, I did not, sir, but I'm happy to look into it for you.
Do you know how many of those reports Congress has received?
I do not.
None. They're required by law, but none. And so do you know how much the cost of electricity has changed in the Marianas over the last 5 years? during which the Interior Department was required by law to be helping us?
I do not, sir.
All right, but not much. Let me tell you. And only because the cost of diesel fuel dropped from $100 in 2014 to around $60 today. So let me ask you this, Mr. Cameron. Shouldn't the Interior Department do what the law requires and establish these energy action plan teams and implement energy action plans and report to Congress every year on your progress? That way, Congress would know whether more needs to be done for places like the Marianas to cut our energy costs. Mr. Cameron, I know Interior has strategic energy plans for each of the islands. The plan for the Marianas was done in 2013. But a year later, Congress passed a law that clearly said it was not enough. The 2013 strategic plan for the Marianas laid out 3 scenarios: no change, 20% reduction in fossil fuels, or 53% reduction. Do you know which scenario came to pass, Mr. Cameron?
I do not, sir.
No change. Because a plan with multiple scenarios is not a plan. A plan without a schedule of implementation is not a plan. A plan without prioritizing specific projects is not a plan. A plan without financing options is not a plan. Yes, every year Interior spends a few $1 million energizing energy communities. And I have other questions that I'd like to ask Mr. Cameron. With all due respect, I will submit them for the record, and hopefully I don't fall right next to Raul's name and get no answers. Thank you. And thank you, sir, for being here today.
Sir, we'd be delighted to respond for the record, and you obviously do a very good job representing your constituents, so thank you.
Yeah, because, you know, sir, I pay $300 a month for electricity, plus another $100 for water. Thank you.
Ledburn, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Under this administration, the Trump administration and the BLM has made efforts to improve and streamline the oil and gas leasing and permitting process on federal lands, and I applaud that. And with those monies, states receive 50% of these revenues to use for public services and programs, and 40% goes to the Bureau of Reclamation and 10% to the Treasury. For instance, one sale recently, a lease in the Permian Basin in 2018, gave the state of New Mexico nearly $500 million. And yet, with that, we still have very responsible and involved environmental protections. Even with these steps, parcels of leased land must still undergo 3 rounds of NEPA before drilling can occur. Now, with all this in mind, Mr. Cameron, can you tell us how much revenue was produced by energy leases on federal lands last year?
It looks like, based on the cliff notes from my colleague here, that we generated about $9.1 billion between 2016 and 2018.
Okay, thank you. And even though some of my colleagues may not understand this, this administration is also working hard to develop renewable energy as well as conventional sources with great success. In fact, the recent wind lease sale off the coast of Massachusetts generated a record-breaking $405 million in bonus bid revenues. So we know that offshore wind and other sources of renewable energy have potential to provide energy and to provide revenues. How much is included for renewables in your budget, and how can we increase our ability to better access renewable forms of energy?
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamborn, for that question. So our budget includes $81 million for renewable energy, and you're absolutely right. The department is pursuing an all of the above approach, if you will, to energy. We're very excited about the interest on the OCS in particular for offshore wind. And we hope that'll have potential across the country. And as I know you're aware, there's a lot of wind energy and solar energy and geothermal energy development in particular on BLM lands across the country, and we are encouraging that. We hope that the expedited environmental review process that still substantively complies with the law, but doesn't have us generating thousands of pieces of paper, and instead we're generating hundreds of pieces of paper to achieve the same environmental analysis. We're hoping that will lead to more renewable energy production as well as more conventional energy production and allow more people to get jobs sooner across the country.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a responsible and balanced approach. I agree with an all-of-the-above energy approach, including renewables, and I approve of clearing away regulatory undergrowth so that these things can be done more reasonably and responsibly and in a time-effective manner. I'm going to ask a more specific question now on the issue of a 3D elevation program, or 3DEP. How does the USGS apparently has identified more than 600 applications of this process, of this technology that would benefit from enhanced elevation data. Data can be applied to flood risk management, infrastructure, water resources, aviation safety, telecommunications, homeland security, emergency response, precision agriculture, energy, pipeline safety, as well as other areas. So where does the budget stand in terms of 3D elevation programs?
We are, the 2020 budget, Mr. Lamborn, includes about $36 million for the U.S. Geological Survey, which is essentially the same level as we had in the continuing resolution. And you're absolutely correct that this technological capacity will enable federal, state, local, tribal land managers to make better decisions because you've got higher resolution data. It also gives us much better insight into geologic structures, which in turn gives us some better information about where critical mineral resources might be located in places we might not have previously imagined. You know, we'd have these resources.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Cox?
Thank you, Mr. Cameron, Ms. Flanagan, for testifying today. You're probably no doubt aware that my congressional district, the 21st of California, was ground zero for California's most recent drought. The pain caused by the lack of a reliable water supply just can't be understated. You had homes that went without drinking water, fields that were fallowed, groundwater aquifers that were depleted. Just across the board, communities were devastated. And all of these impacts are linked to the simple fact that surface water supplies to my congressional district, and certainly Central Valley, California, have become significantly less reliable over the last 2 decades. But yet this budget decreases funding for projects to diversify water supply and decreases funding for surface storage. I think you just made the quote that many people would agree that California needs more storage. And certainly I would hope that you were one of those people that agree with that sentiment. So I'd be grateful if you would identify the specific items in this budget request that would allow reclamation to increase surface water supply reliability to the people in my district. And for each of those items, how much water can be restored to the communities in my district? More broadly, what are the challenges reclamation faces in restoring water supply reliability? And what does this budget request do to address those challenges?
Sir, that's a very detailed question. I think we'll want to provide you a more detailed answer for the record, but at a high level, I would point out that, first of all, I agree with you that California needs more water supply reliability. I think additional surface water storage is part of that. The President's budget does include a number of specific projects. For instance, we're looking at elevating the height of Shasta Dam. We're spending some money on feasibility studies and NEPA compliance work for additional storage north of the Delta Sites Reservoir, for instance. There's related work for Los Vaqueros, Del Puerto, and we're also spending some time and money proposing to work with the Friant Kern Canal Company on some of the water delivery issues that they have. There is funding for the CalFed program. There is research money, not just in Bureau of Reclamation, but also in the U.S. Geological Survey, looking at how we might more intelligently manage flows for delta smelt in the delta and perhaps use a little bit less water in the process. I know that's something that Senator Feinstein also has an interest in on the other side of the hill. So we are taking a multi-pronged approach, and I'd be delighted to give you a more detailed response for the record.
Thanks so much. And with regard to Frank Kern, as you know, subsidence is such a big issue there. Is that because of the groundwater and depletion of the aquifers, that the canal is really is being degraded by as much as 60%, and it's no longer functioning as designed. And for example, during the last big wet year in 2016-2017, the canal was only functioning at 40% of its capacity, and that really resulted in the loss of some 300,000 acre-feet of water that could not be delivered to recharge those aquifers. This year is shaping up to be a very similar year. I think you probably saw some of the pictures of the snowpack up there. And so could you give me some more specifics in terms of the dollars and assistance that's being, the DOI is using to address that challenge?
Yes, sir, I'm happy to do that. So Reclamation has spent around $10 million in federal funds, have been provided to the Friant Water Authority through financial assistance agreements. And of that, $2.2 million in infrastructure and improvement was part of the WIN Act submission that came up to the Congress around February 13th. So those are some of the more recent developments. It is a very significant problem. There's no doubt that the capacity of a canal has really been impeded by subsidence. The department recognizes that problem, and we're trying to work with the local authorities to address it.
Thank you so much, and yield back to Chairman.
Nice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here today. We appreciate it. I'd like to run down the path specifically on the Department of Interior as a whole, but National Park Service more specifically, in the issue of managing the maintenance backlog. My understanding of this is the budget is asking for roughly $797 million for facility operations and maintenance. And within that, there's $132 million for repair and rehabilitation, which deals with maintenance backlog. Then there's $134 million that basically is going to try to prevent the growth of maintenance backlogs. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. You've got the numbers just about right.
Okay. So we're looking at $132 million being dedicated to the backlog, $134 million to prevent backlog. Here's my concern. I think Chairman Grijalva and Mr. Bishop both have worked. I think they've set a great example in working together in a bipartisan way to try to restore and to deal with the maintenance backlog. And I'm not sure that you're really taking this whole thing seriously. It looks like, to be honest with you, this whole proposal here is kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free kind of card and not deal with the issue. I'm fearful that we're going to pass this thing and you're going to be back here in a couple of years and still we're going to have the maintenance backlog problem that we've continued to have. It's inexcusable, and we've got to address this problem. What assurances can you provide that that's not the case?
Sir, so one doesn't solve a $16 billion department-wide maintenance backlog problem overnight or even in 5 years, and frankly, probably doesn't even go away in 10 years. But I think the President's budget has us headed in the right direction to to gradually reduce that maintenance backlog, given this committee's interest on a bipartisan basis in the Public Lands Infrastructure Fund, legislation in the previous Congress, and I'm anticipating equal bipartisan interest in this Congress. That could give us $1.5 billion a year in mandatory spending that would contribute toward reducing the maintenance backlog, and a large fraction of that, 70% of that money, would be going to the Park Service. I think the point is we recognize we have a problem. We're investing in trying to deal with that problem. Were the Congress to pass the Public Lands Infrastructure Fund legislation, that would be a major help. And in the meantime, we have to balance on the appropriated side daily operations in the parks with our desire to deal with the maintenance backlog that you very correctly characterized.
Well, all due respect, I think you're giving us answers of what needs to happen, but I'm not seeing a whole lot actually happen. You've told us what needs to happen. I want to know what assurances do we have that it's going to happen. And I'm just deeply concerned that this maintenance backlog, it continues to get bigger and bigger and a more significant problem year after year, and we're just not adequately addressing it. I've only got a little bit, and I would like for you to respond to that if you can, but I want to hit on one more issue, and then we'll go from there. The American Battlefield Protection grant seems to, has been cut. This, as you well know, is a one-to-one matching grant program that in reality sees about a 6-to-1 taxpayer funding. It's extremely efficient and effective, one of the more successful programs I believe that we have here in the Park Services. Can you walk me through the reasoning behind that cut?
I'm not privy to the detailed discussion around why that decision was made. I would make the more general observation that there are hundreds, indeed thousands of decisions that have to be made across the line items in the department, and we had to set priorities, and there are a number of situations where we'd have loved to have funded an activity, but we felt that money had to go to higher priorities, and I suspect this is one of those instances.
All right. I would challenge that, but my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Holland?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr. Cameron, Ms. Flanagan, thanks for joining us today. Mr. Cameron, the mission of the Department of the Interior is to protect and manage the nation's natural resources and cultural heritage, provide scientific and other information about those resources, and above all, honor its responsibilities or special commitments to American Indians, Alaska Natives, and affiliated communities. About a year ago, a full third of senior department career officials were reassigned, and it happened that they were all Native American. Employees whose voices would be valued and important in this era of the department. And I raise this because I believe that tribal consultation has been largely jeopardized in many areas of this department of late and of this administration. Additionally, moving veterans at the department to not make the best use of the knowledge and experience that have been acquired by these Native American officials, which ultimately affects budgetary considerations. So one question I have is, has the department moved any of these Native American officials back to their areas of expertise?
I appreciate that question. The honest answer is I don't know. I've got no information on those particular individuals, where they were transferred to, where they were transferred from. I would make the general observation that the Office of Personnel Management has government-wide policy that career senior executives ought to be moving around. They ought to be changing jobs. About 15%, if memory serves me correctly, a year of the career SESers are supposed to move from one position to another. So moving senior executives around is not unusual. It's not something that's specific to this administration. It's been going on since the Senior Executive Service was established under President Carter. But I've got no specific knowledge about those particular individuals that you referred to.
Okay, I appreciate that, and we can do more research on that ourselves. The second is, do you plan to be more fair about the diversity that is necessary to run this department? And what does the budget reflect in terms of making right with Indian country? Because you must know that tribes across the country were extremely dismayed that their folks were being moved, and it wasn't to it wasn't to higher up positions. It's not that the move benefited the career employees. It actually, nobody felt like it did. So the question is, what does the budget reflect in terms of making, regarding this diversity and staying true to the department's mission of its trust responsibility to Indian tribes?
So the President's 2020 budget includes a little bit less than $3 billion for Indian-related programs. $1.9 billion is for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and a little bit less than $1 billion, a little bit more than $900 million is the Bureau of Indian Education, and of course there's also the Office of Special Trustee for American Indians as well. There is, as I know you're aware, an annual process of interaction with the tribes where we ask the tribes what their budget priorities are, and as we put together the department's request and ultimately our submission to OMB, we try to track as closely as we possibly can to the feedback that we get from the tribes through that formal annual budget consultation process.
So I have another set of questions. Just in terms of your position there, do you believe the department, do you believe that consultation with tribal governments is necessary before the department makes important decisions that impact tribal communities?
As a general principle, yes, of course. I would defer to Assistant Secretary Sweeney and our Solicitor's Office on exactly what that means and how it ought to be implemented in specific circumstances.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Last month, 3 of the 5 leaders of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition appeared before this committee to tell us that they feel they were not heard during the President's illegal alteration of the Bears Ears National Monument. They received one brief meeting with the Secretary, during which he ignored many of their concerns, while special interests received unfettered access to the process. Does this align with the need to consult tribal governments, in your opinion?
I was not involved in any of the monument-related discussions, so I'm really not qualified to comment on that. I don't know who consulted with whom when, and so I'm sorry, I'm just not qualified to comment meaningfully on that.
Okay, I appreciate that, and Chairman, I yield.
Mr. Gosar?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Cameron and Ms. Flanagan for coming today. We certainly appreciate that. Mr. Cameron, first of all, I want to thank the department's investments in offshore and onshore oil and gas development. I mean, the innovation and technology that we've seen in the improvements in oil and gas industry are the main reason the U.S. was a leader in emissions reductions in 2015, 2016, and 2017. So that's very good. Can you give me a little highlight of why that investment is so prolific, particularly in light of some of the backlogs and some of these financial issues, why it's so important with this energy renaissance?
Well, the more energy we can produce on federal lands, the more revenue there is to the Treasury, the more revenue there is to state governments in the immediate vicinity. And speaking very selfishly, if the Public Lands Infrastructure Fund legislation moves ahead, that means more money to deal with the maintenance backlog across the Department of Interior. And based on the latest proposal, the Forest Service would actually get some of that revenue as well, up to $1.5 billion a year. Not to mention the fact, of course, that activity generates a lot of jobs, high-paying jobs, and that's important. Not just for the people who are getting the payroll, but for the restaurants and gasoline stations that that are visited by those employees. So it's an important benefit for our society. That's one reason that the department is investing in energy development, not to mention the national security benefits of our foreign policy not being nearly as subject to influence from abroad if we're able to be energy independent at home.
Well, and tying that in with Mr. Heiss's comments in regards to this backlog, I mean, you know, with a 640 million acre estate that's sitting out there in this backlog, I'm happy to see that we're trying to minimize our acquisition and more looking at the investment of maintaining that backlog. You know, I've got a county by the name of La Paz County that's 5% private land. The rest is federal estate and some state, but mostly federal. So, I mean, that is a huge application to her. So I like that applause. The next thing is the ranking member in the subcommittee on energy and minerals. I want to get back to the USGS budget. And less than 20% of the United States has been geologically mapped at a scale useful for mineral and energy exploration or for local land planning use. And as you know, the U.S. is now 100% dependent on foreign countries for 20 metals and minerals. We can't keep being reliant, particularly on countries like China in regards, if we want technology like this with the rare earths. Now, I applaud the department's investment in the critical mineral research data collection in the 2020 budget that will help reverse this dangerous dependency. Mr. Cameron, can you discuss why this dependency is so dangerous and elaborate on the importance of the President Trump's critical minerals executive order?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So as you observed, there are critical and strategic minerals that we need for manufacturing purposes, that we carry around dozens of those minerals in these things every day. Some of us carry 2 of these things around every day. And to be dependent on foreign countries, and let's be honest, I think we're talking about China in particular. China is blessed with vast resources of strategic and critical minerals. And we probably don't want to be either in an economic situation or a strategic situation where we are dependent upon the goodwill of the Chinese government to be able to use our iPhones or our other technologies, not to endorse a particular manufacturer here. The administration, as you observed, Mr. Grossar, issued an executive order on strategic and critical minerals that directs a number of the departments of government, including Interior, to pay attention to this issue. Interior has an investment in our 2020 budget that looks like $30 million on critical minerals, and we believe that the technological capacities that geological survey could offer us would enable us to find some of these resources here in the United States, which would have economic benefits, foreign policy benefits, and create jobs here in America. And all of those would be good things.
I know it's very important because in my district, they're laying all over the desert, by the way. So thank you very much, Mr. Cameron.
Ms. DeGette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cameron, thank you for coming, and Ms. Flanagan. Do you and other leaders of the Interior Department believe that this budget is a blueprint for responsibly managing our natural resources and judiciously using our taxpayer dollars?
Yes, Congressman.
And would you also agree that the Interior, these are the easy questions, that the Interior Department should try and reduce opportunities for waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement within their programs and operations?
Absolutely, and we are working that.
Okay, so I want to talk about that for a minute. At the beginning of March, the Government Accountability Office issued a report detailing federal programs and operations that are at the highest risk to waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement. I don't know if you've seen that report or not.
I've scanned it on more than one occasion, but I couldn't recite a chapter and verse here in front of me.
I'm not going to ask for that. But the GAO in this report said that Interior's management of federal oil and gas resources was on the list, but this time the GAO found that the Interior had regressed since the last high-risk list. Did you know that?
I did not.
Okay. Do you know why the GAO said Interior had regressed?
No, I don't.
Well, what they said was it was the repeal of the methane waste rule. Specifically, GAO said, quote, the effect of Interior's recent regulatory actions on methane emissions and oil and gas measurement may not be consistent with our prior work. Our recommendations related to methane emissions and oil and gas measurement are important for ensuring the government collects the royalties it is due. Interior may hinder its demonstrated progress if the recent regulatory actions jeopardize its prior efforts to implement our recommendations. Now, do you agree with the GAO that the BLM's 2018 methane revisions will lead to more wasted resources?
No, I don't, but frankly, that particular topic is outside of my wheelhouse, and I'm not in a position, I think, to authoritatively comment on it. That's a better question, I think, for probably Bureau of Land Management.
Well, I'll ask them that too, but you are the Principal Deputy Assistant for Policy Management and Budget, is that right?
That is correct.
And from a policy and budget perspective, don't you think that the Interior Department should be doing everything in its power to ensure the government collects the royalties that it's due?
We are doing everything to ensure that we collect the royalties.
And don't you think they should do everything they can?
I believe we are doing everything that we can.
Well, the BLM said that the revisions to the methane rule is doing the opposite because it's reducing the royalty payments and it's bad for taxpayers. But let me follow on. In addition to this waste, of course, I'm sure you know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas with up to 36 times the global warming impact of carbon dioxide. And when it's released, the volatile organic compounds are also released, which contributes to smog in places like my district, Denver, Colorado, and cities around the country. And so Colorado was the first state in the country to directly regulate methane emissions from oil and gas operations. Are you familiar with the position of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association on Colorado's methane regulation measures?
I am not, Congressman.
Okay, well, good news. I have a fact sheet right here published by the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that it be entered into the record. Thank you so much. And what it says is, and I'll give you a copy of this too after, it says Colorado has led the nation in creating some of the most stringent air regulations in the U.S. In 2014, the state was the first to regulate methane emissions from oil and natural gas production, estimated to reduce more than 60,000 tons of methane emissions per year. Now, this is a fact sheet from the Oil and Gas Association bragging about the state's methane regulations that are improving the air and improving the economy, but the BLM has rolled back the methane leakage standards, which were based on Colorado's. And so my whole point, and you're used to this, you used to be on the committee staff, but when you repeal the BLM methane regulations, it threatens public health, it contributes to climate change, and it allows the waste of millions of dollars of taxpayer money that could be paid. And so this is why a lot of us are really concerned about this. I want to thank you for taking the time to come today, and I'll give you a copy of this. And I would urge you to talk to your friends at the BLM to think about reversing their rules. Thank you, and I yield back.
We'll definitely do that, Congressman. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you both for being here and taking the time to give us your insights today. We appreciate it very much. The President's proposed budget requests roughly $930 million for the DOI's law enforcement programs, which include border enforcement, of course. Mr. Cameron, you note in your testimony that the Department of Interior manages more than 655 miles of land along our southern border and over 12.5 million acres of land within 50 miles of the border. Under President Trump, the department has prioritized border security, and the efforts from DOI show that the administration's focus on the border has been tremendously successful. From May of 2018 to November of that same year, DOI apprehended over 4,000 people attempting to enter our country illegally. In comparison, during that same May to November timeframe in 2016 under the Obama administration, DOI only apprehended 126 people on the border. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for consent to include in the record 2 DOI press releases from May and November of 2018. Thank you. Here's a question, and maybe both of you could answer it, but why do you think DOI's efforts in 2018 to secure the border were so successful compared to the previous administration?
Well, I can tell you that we have put more of our own law enforcement people on the southern border without, I should say, impinging on our ability to perform our law enforcement mission in other parts of the country. I would like to think that it's got something to do with it.
Ms. Flanagan, you want to add anything to that? You concur? All right. Did the 400 apprehensions from May to November 2018 occur at legal ports of entry or in between ports of entry? Do you know?
I don't know, but I'm happy to get that information for the record for you, Mr. Johnson.
That'd be helpful. I appreciate it. Is DOI still encountering large numbers of people trying to cross the border illegally that you know of?
We still have an active presence in the border. We still have those several dozen extra agents working on the border on our land. And I can tell you that the Department of Homeland Security is grateful that we are doing a better job of protecting our own lands and resources along the border, and that is freeing up resources for them to allocate wherever they think the highest priority, highest risks are off of DOI lands.
We applaud and appreciate that collaboration with Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol, and we hope that'll help our future efforts in securing our southern border. We need that. We're grateful for it. Another line of questions, real quick, in the time I have. Keeping on the same topic of law enforcement, there's an ongoing issue in my district of patrolling the Kisatchie National Forest. It's in Louisiana. I know that the Forest Service is under USDA's jurisdiction, but it's my understanding that their law enforcement capabilities are spread so thin, and sometimes they have to reimburse local law enforcement officials to patrol the forests because they just don't have the manpower. Low reimbursement rates have strained our local law enforcement agencies, and they have relayed to my office that the Forest Service has been difficult to work with sometimes to find a solution, and sometimes they're even non-responsive to messages and emails. Some of the issues they're dealing with are very serious. A quick example, Christmas weekend 2017, a local sheriff was notified by Texas officials that a suspected child molester was on the run and hiding in the forest. They pinged his cell phone. He was in the Kisatchie Forest. The Forest Service officer was on vacation, so our local sheriff's deputies had to go in and find the fugitive. Here's the question. The DOI budget requests $930 million for law enforcement programs. Can you speak to the extent that these programs collaborate with other federal entities like the Forest Service?
So we try to take a coordinated approach on a geographic basis with our sister federal agencies, whether they're part of the Interior Department or not part of the Interior Department. We also have a number of relationships with local law enforcement, county sheriffs, for instance, across the country, particularly in the West, where the scale of the land is so vast that a county sheriff or a local police department may be able to respond much faster than a park ranger, for instance, or a BLM ranger. So we're always looking for ways to enhance and improve our cooperation with state and local law enforcement. One aspect of that is using the same radio technology. That's been an ongoing issue for quite a long time, and frankly, one we're still working at. If we can't communicate effectively with each other, then that makes coordination a problem.
I just want to say on behalf of our sheriffs, thank you for that effort and that commitment. They wanted me to ask you to commit to work with local law enforcement officials to try and get resources to areas where they're sorely needed. So I know you get that. You're keenly interested in it. We appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. I want to ask you about the proposed oil and gas lease sale in the Arctic Refuge, which Assistant Secretary Bailash has publicly stated numerous times will be moving forward this year. That would be in fiscal year 2020. However, there is a table in your budget, it is Table 6, that includes revenues from the lease sale in the refuge, and it indicates the first lease sale happening in fiscal year 2022. Can you please please help me understand when you expect the lease sale to actually occur?
Assistant Secretary Backlog is obviously a lot closer to that than I am, so I think I'd have to go back to the department and consult with him.
What's the assumption in your budget?
The assumption in our budget is that leasing in the 1002 area of the coastal plain of Anwar would generate about $1 billion.
Right, I'm going to get to the amount in a minute, but the year, the timing for the lease sale.
I can tell you there's an ongoing NEPA process. We expect the NEPA process to be over by the end of this calendar year, which would bring us to the beginning of FY 2020.
Okay. You are not budgeting for a lease sale in fiscal 2020, correct?
I believe that's accurate, but I reserve the right to clarify that for the record.
Let's talk about the amount of the revenue projections in your budget as well. It says that the federal share of the Arctic Refuge lease revenues will be $725 million, but it says that twice, and so it totals those two lines to be about $1.5 billion, which I believe gets you total revenues of $3 billion from the first lease. The state of Alaska would get half. And so I'm trying to understand, since there are these two references, they're rolled up to $1.5 billion. Is that what you believe to be the total onshore revenues, federal share, or has there been some kind of a mistake in that entry?
The $1.5 billion figure sounds very familiar, Congressman. We are using CBO estimates at this time, and those estimates are periodically reviewed.
CBO has projected much lower numbers in the past, and the fact that you listed that number twice is the reason I'm asking. Did you intend to do that, or was that an error?
I think what I'd like to do is take a closer look at that when I get back to the office and respond for the record. I don't feel capable of responding on the fly to that.
Well, I appreciate that. It certainly seems like it merits a closer look because this is a lease sale covering 1.5 million acres, and that number would give you a range of $1,000 to $2,000 an acre. Do you know the highest bid per acre in the past 10 years in the neighboring National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska?
I do not.
$67 per acre, and your budget reflects $1,000 to $2,000 per acre. In fact, the average in that sale, in that period for the National Petroleum Reserve was $13 per acre offer, and the highest ever in history in 1999 was $120 per acre. So we are orders of magnitude into fantasy land on the revenue projections that appear in your budget. And I can only hope that the environmental review process is being done a little more carefully. By the way, there is an actual person who puts these numbers together, right?
Yes, sir.
I was beginning to worry that someone was spinning a wheel or throwing darts at a wall. But I want to talk now about the environmental review process because earlier this month, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility posted 19 previously secret memos from the Fish and Wildlife Service about impacts of oil and gas drilling. These talked about data gaps and everything from subsistence use to polar bears, air quality, impacts on vegetation. It identified a series of 10 priority studies that would need to happen in order to meet near-term regulatory requirements in the 1002 area that we're talking about here. The polar bear study alone would run 4 years, cost about $2.7 million. The other studies would be very costly and take some time. Is there any money in your budget for these things? Because I don't see it.
Sir, I'm not familiar with those communications that you referred to, and
they're not in your budget, right? I mean, it's either in there or not. And Ms. Flanagan, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not in your budget.
Sir, I would have to. First of all, I'm not aware of those particular.
Well, I'm aware because I read the budget. Now, these studies were kept secret. There have been numerous FOIA requests. They were not even listed as being withheld. If there is a benign reason for why someone in leadership of your department buried these critical studies, now's a great time to tell us that.
Sir, I don't think I grant your premise that we are burying any studies.
Thank you. Mr. Gomer? Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Both of you. Mr. Cameron, as you know, payment in lieu of taxes, or PILT program, it really is an important program for those counties that have significant federal lands within them. You know, it can't be taxed. And the original agreement, and I realize this, we're talking about agriculture here when we talk about national forests, but it also, the interior's lands have a similar effect. It may produce some revenue. You may have a great tourist attraction that brings in some revenue, but it's still debilitating to local schools, local government. One of my counties has a national forest, and when they were producing timber, renewable timber, we're not talking sequoias, as you know, but these are renewable resource. Back in the 80s, they were getting 1.5, 1.6 or so $million for a rural county. And I think last number I saw was 64,000 now. Devastating to a county like that. And I understand secure rural schools, that's not under your jurisdiction, but would you talk about ways that you see we might be able to help rural areas that have interior land within the counties to help them with the revenue they're losing by having federal land there?
Yes, Mr. Gohmert. The President's budget for the Interior includes $465 million in 2020 for payments in lieu of taxes. We're very mindful of the burden that communities can face if there are large federal land holdings. And in my prior life, I worked for a senator from Nevada, and we had some counties in Nevada that were 97% federally owned. And the county commissioners would sometimes come to us and say, we need to put a new roof on the high school, or we need to build a new elementary school, or our roads are not in very good shape. And that PILT money was really important to those communities.
One of my concerns about PILT is, as we see more and more of the population moving into cities, urban areas, that means less representation for rural areas. And my concern is someday they may say, forget the rural schools, move to the city, and it just devastate, middle America. So, whether it's taking some of the federal land and letting local folks have it so they can produce some revenue and make it, whatever, there really needs to be a realistic approach to that, because I'm not sure we can always count on PILT to take care of the difference. But let me quickly go to the border area. You know, there's 12.5 million acres under Interior's jurisdiction within 50 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. But there's more than 655 miles of our southern border is managed by your bureaus under Interior. And 75 border miles is in tribal lands, primarily the Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona. And I've been down there. I was surprised how much, talking to law enforcement, that those are used by drug cartels to get drugs into the United States. But what environmental effects have you seen in those areas controlled by Interior on our border, by drug cartels using them when our own law enforcement can't use motorized vehicles?
That's a real problem in some areas, Mr. Gohmert. We've got, in some cases, we have endangered species critical habitat on federal land that we're trying to conserve. In many instances, there are archaeological resources like petroglyphs, for instance, that are at some risk of being trashed. And then there's the trash problem itself, not to mention the fact that some of the people who are crossing illegally may find themselves in a serious medical condition.
Yeah, they're not been able to get. Let me ask real quick. My time's running out. But whereas prior administrations put up signs saying this is controlled basically by drug running, so use another area. What's Interior doing to avoid using those signs and allowing the land to be used by Americans?
Sir, we are working very hard to make sure that we are protecting everybody who's on our land, might be crossing from the south, whether they're American citizens or folks who are not doing something legal.
Thank you. Let me, time expired, Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. I want to follow up on a question I think that was asked earlier, but hopefully you could get more of a definitive answer. How many land into trust applications are currently pending in your department?
Sir, I don't have that information, but I'm happy to supply it for the record.
Yeah, I'd love that. So if you give me that exact number, I'd appreciate it. But would you say there is at least a backlog at this point? Because that's what we're hearing, there's a backlog in these applications.
I really don't feel comfortable speculating. I want to make sure I give you the right information. I'm sorry.
Okay, from the information that we're receiving, that there is, and it only concerns me more because we believe that a 10% cut from the BIA's Trust Natural Resource Management budget is only going to exacerbate that backlog. So, I think it's really important for, number one, you to get that number, and number two, to also understand whether or not we're in a backlog, and number three, understand your budget would only make that problem worse. Moving on. My subcommittee recently had a hearing on the national crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. American Indian and Alaska Native women are murdered at a rate 10 times the national average, due in part to severe lack of resources. But your budget actually cuts tribal courts and tribal law enforcement programs instead of dramatically increasing them to address this epidemic and growing crisis. Is there any understanding, or is there any thought about relooking in terms of your investment in these communities, as particularly with the missing Indigenous women that we're currently dealing with?
Congressman, I think you accurately hone in on the problem of missing and potentially murdered Indigenous women. I know Assistant Secretary Sweeney is very concerned about that. And the department is exploring ways to raise the profile of that issue. Simply being
Mr. Cameron, the profile has been raised. We raised it. This is what we're doing on this committee, and I'm raising it with you. What I'd like to see is that there's an actual commitment to fixing it in terms of true investment in terms of dollars, and cutting tribal courts, which in return means it makes it more difficult for these tribes to prosecute a lot of these violators, does not help that situation. Let's move on, though. Your budget also cuts over half of BIA's infrastructure budget for tribes. In 2017, NCAI called the infrastructure funding backlog in Indian country a long-standing crisis that included billions of dollars in construction backlogs on tribal land. Just last month, Chairman Terry Rambler of Arizona's San Carlos Apache tribe testified of the government's failure to replace a condemned building used by the tribal police department, saying that the water is routinely out and the public restrooms are closed. The carpets near the restrooms and the ceiling tiles are stained and emit a distinct odor. The power routinely cuts out, which then shuts off the air conditioning. And yet, your department is proposing to cut investment in infrastructure programs that could spur economic growth, improve public health, strengthen tribal justice systems, and allow Indian country to thrive. Do you believe this budget would ensure that the federal government honors its solemn trust and responsibilities to these tribal communities? Do you truly believe what you are presenting us is going to do that?
Sir, what I can tell you is we have tried to closely follow the advice, the recommendations that we've gotten through the annual tribal consultation process on the budget. We've tried to reflect the priorities that they've been communicated to us. We have perhaps erred on the side of trying to deal with operations issues with the Indian tribes and de-emphasize to some extent construction activity, but I would also point out that the public lands infrastructure legislation I know this committee is interested in would provide additional resources for BIE school construction.
Thank you. But one of the things I think that I'd like to also point out that this proposed funding level that you're having in terms of real dollars is going to be the lowest level it has been in almost 2 decades. So with all the problems that I just described, with all what I'm hearing from our tribal leaders, And with all the things that we are now discovering, specifically when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women, your budget does not reflect that this is a priority to you. It truly does not reflect that it's something that you need to value, and I think you should really relook at your budget if you want to have that solemn trust with our Indian country. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here today and spending the time with us. In Utah, the Central Utah Water Project, once completed, will supply water to Utah County, Salt Lake County, many cities, and as so many other places, we're in the middle of a desert. It's an incredibly important project. Last year, Congress appropriated $15 million for their annual budget. The DOI budget had $10 million. They can actually accommodate up to $30 million of work per year. This is a project, as I understand it, that will pay back all this revenue back to the federal government through revenues from the project. Can you give me any insight, or are you familiar with the project, about funding and the opportunity to increase that funding up to the appropriations level?
Thank you very much for that question. I am somewhat familiar with CUPCA, and I'd observed that the local governments are very good partners with us on that. They're doing good work. It's a worthwhile, valuable program. In terms of the prospects for appropriations, I think I would leave that to you and your colleagues on the Appropriations Committee. As we develop the President's budget, there are numerous trade-offs that we had to make. But I think we would all agree that CUPCA is a worthy project.
Thank you. I would hope that as you consider the budget, you'd look at the appropriations from previous years and have that be somewhat influential in your decisions. The other big issue in my district is fires on federal land. We had some of the largest fires in the state's history, Polk Creek Fire and Bald Mountain Fire last year. Your written testimony had some information about fire suppression efforts. Could you comment on that, and as well as disaster recovery after these fires?
Yes. So for quite a long time, as I know we're aware, we've had problems with fuels management, both in forest and rangeland ecosystems. That's produced uncontrolled wildfire. And what we're trying to do through our wildland fire budget is to put a bit more emphasis on fuels reduction to reduce the frequency and severity of wildland fire. We are pleased that the Congress provided the opportunity to potentially tap into $300 million in disaster funding if we have a really bad fire year. And the administration's legislation that I hope will be arriving up on the Hill fairly soon will include a comprehensive initiative on active forest and rangeland management, which ought to enable us to get a better handle on more effectively and efficiently addressing wildland fire risks.
Thank you. Really pleased with my constituents' response to this fire. We actually had to send the Red Cross home. They left not because we weren't using them, but because more families came in to volunteer to house families than families that needed housing. And so it was a great response from the community. But there was an underlying frustration that because of the fuels that you mentioned, this didn't need to happen. And appreciate your comments on that. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Ranker for the opportunity. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Cameron and Ms. Flanagan. As the threat of climate change increases in scale and urgency, American lives and resources are increasingly at stake. And at this critical time, the Department of Interior is calling for a decrease in funding. I'm deeply concerned you are setting up your agency for catastrophic failure, and it's our constituents who will pay the price. For years, as our Republican colleagues have sat in these committees with their fingers in their ears, my team and I have been working to develop a framework for climate action that will help us build consensus around solutions that deal with this imminent risk. During that same 2-year period, the Trump administration has scorned its sacred duty to serve and protect the American people and has instead made drastic cuts to vital climate research and science programs. This bad faith approach has endangered millions of Americans across every single congressional district, including the farmers and ranchers that my Republican colleagues claim to serve. Mr. Cameron, I'm happy to say that for the first time in many years, climate change is an issue that we're once again discussing in this Congress. The impacts of climate change are real and they are dire, and despite what EPA Administrator Wheeler has testified, they are not 50 or 75 years off. We're seeing the major impacts of climate change now in hurricanes and floods and in wildfires. These are all issues that will impact the Department of the Interior, damaging our public lands, threatening tribal and insular communities, and putting our resources at risk. It is time to move past the partisan bickering and to talk sense about climate change. So, does the leadership of Interior agree that climate change, driven primarily by human emission of fossil fuels, poses a threat to our nation through more frequent and severe natural disasters and an increase in the variability of our weather systems?
Sir, I think we'd agree that climate change is happening. I think we'd agree that climate change is something that we need to deal with in very practical ways in terms of the way we manage our forests, our rangelands, and our water resources. And that's how the department is trying to focus its efforts, both through science and on the ground management, to try to deal with the real world and empirical, what we're facing on a daily basis, challenges that may at least in part be a result of climate change.
But do you believe that climate change poses a threat to public health, to our environment, and to our economy?
I think I agree it poses a series of threats. I do not claim to be a climate expert, so I wouldn't want to say which threat was more important than another or attempt to quantify them. That's not within my skill set, I'm afraid.
But do you believe they pose a threat to those three given dynamics that I mentioned?
I would imagine that they would in various places to varying degrees.
And will Interior commit to using practical, science-based strategies to begin adapting to and mitigating the impacts of climate change?
Yes, we are using science to try to address a wide variety of on-the-ground resource management challenges, and environmental change is one of the many factors that we have to deal with.
And what are some of those examples of how you're adapting to science-based?
For instance, we are very much aware of the fact that drought conditions require more water conservation activities.